Hello and welcome back to the Wandering Cantos. Today we're going to be taking a look at the poetic genius of Shiori Novella. So, today we're looking at Monsters and Men, which is her first original song, and I believe it was released on February 15th, 2026. I saw someplace mention it was the 16th, so I don't know if it was like a midnight release or something like that. But the lyrics for this one were written by Moni. Therefore, it's important to remember that we're discussing this as a Shiori Novella project, thus why we're calling it the poetic genius of Shiori Novella. I briefly looked over the lyrics before starting this video, and I've got to say, I think this will be a challenging one. The lyrics feel a bit impenetrable, but we're going to do our best. Basically, it sort of feels like an iceberg situation where we are really only seeing the tip of the iceberg, but there's a whole lot more under the surface. So, things to keep in mind. As always, I like to give a general disclaimer, which is, basically with all of these videos, I just want to remind everyone, these are just my personal interpretations and observations, and I am by no means intending to sort of project my own ideas and themes onto the artists. The death of the author is a concept with this sort of field of literary criticism, which basically states that once a piece of writing is published, it's no longer the sole property of the writer in terms or in regards of interpretation. So therefore, interpretations can be made without necessarily needing to follow the author's intent. So basically, everyone has their own unique life experiences and have, consumed different pieces of media, etc. So they're going to have different interpretations of a piece of writing. And so if a story or a piece of writing or a poem means one thing to you and the author says it's supposed to mean a different thing, your interpretation is still valid. That being said, it's always helpful to still consider author's intent when looking at this sort of stuff. To give some quick further reading before we jump into it, if you end up enjoying this sort of discussion and you enjoy the song, you might want to check out Isabella and the Pot of Basil by John Keats. Basically, if you like lovers keeping relics of their deceased partners for comfort, this one's for you. Or Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. I just feel like its personification of death is relevant, as we'll get into. So, we can now pretty much jump into the close reading. To make things more organized, we're going to kind of follow some steps. We're going to read the passage, then we will look for rhyme scheme, and then we will go line by line to identify metaphor, simile, imagery, tone, etc. to sort of get those indicators of theme and then analyze the theme. So, with that being said, I think we can jump right into it. All right, so here we have our intro and our first verse. So, main part of the intro I want to highlight is the lingering in him section. But the first verse goes, "He's made of sin, nothing in the abyss he calls a soul. Eating at him, there's a rage, he hunts to feel any little thing. He's desperate, sure, but even more, he won't live another day. Picked the wrong victim and cried, 'God, spare me, oh please.' As light left his eyes, she contemplates how her heart it aches. The memory of him keeps her warm, and safe in her bed there lies a pile of bones and echoes of a love that's dead and gone. Seen it all, been done before, cliche, but it's real history." As for end rhymes, we have soul, thing, day, please, aches, lies, gone, and history. So there's no real clear rhyme scheme here. So therefore, as for meaning, there's sort of a lot to unpack here. So we have these two different characters here. There's a he and a she. But there's also potentially more going on in that the wrong victim. The wrong victim in this may be someone else, but again, this is going to be a challenging one, so we're just going to have to work through it. So he's made of sin, so we have someone who's made of sin, and there's nothing in the abyss he calls a soul. Now, at first I thought that this might be saying like, in the abyss that is within him, there's nothing he can call a soul, but we don't have that can call a soul. Instead, I think what it's saying is that there's nothing going on within the abyss that he calls his soul. So he thinks he has a soul, but it's actually just an abyss according to our speaker narrator. Now, here's what's interesting about writing stuff like this is you always have to wonder who's actually telling you the information. Are they a trustworthy source? Are they not? How do they know that? And sort of like, are they omnipotent, like God and all-knowing in that sense? Or is this their own bias? So he's made of sin. There's nothing in the abyss he calls a soul. So again, if you were to ask him, he would say that he has a soul and, that he's complex in that sense. But this speaker is insulting his soul by saying that it's actually just an abyss. And more so, there's nothing going on in that abyss that he calls a soul. So going into the next one, we learn that there's a rage that eats away at him, and he hunts to feel any little thing. So within that kind of the whole made of sin thing, we get this image of, so this is someone who seems to be attacking others in order to sort of satiate the rage that's eating at him. Now, what's interesting about the usage of eating at him is that it tells us that this isn't necessarily a pleasant experience for him, in the sense that it's not that he's doing these attacks for pleasure, but it's instead to sort of satiate something that's slowly eating away at him. We get eating away at him is like a negative thing, since if something is eating at you, it is, reducing you little by little. So it's not like he's gaining something from this experience. And here, the next line continues this sentiment with saying that he's desperate, but even more, he won't live another day. So now this is where it gets a little confusing. Picked a different voice, it seems, since the use of the parentheses here tells us that he picked the wrong victim and cried, "God spare me, oh please." Now, at first when I read this, I thought that this might have meant that he picked the wrong victim and the victim cried, "God spare me, oh please." But as we get this sort of second part of this, opening verse or stanza, if we're calling it poetry, I think what it's actually saying is, so we have this guy, he's made of sin, our speaker thinks little of them and says that, he doesn't have a soul and he really just has an abyss there. There's nothing going on in it. But this guy is going around hunting people effectively in order to feed the rage that's eating away at him. And there's a desperation to him doing this. So then we get this image that he finds his latest victim, who I would say is the she. And so he goes to, attack, hunt this she person, but he realized too late that he picked the wrong victim, and that this she is actually able to effectively flip the tables on him, leaving him, in a state where he's begging to be spared. However, these pleas to be spared go unanswered, since as light left his eyes, which, we know is sort of a poetic way of describing someone passing on, we get that then she is contemplating how her heart it aches. The memory of him keeps her warm and safe in her bed. So this is interesting because it reveals more of their relationship, that it isn't just that he picked a random person, but my interpretation is, so we have the guy and we have the girl, and the guy, in order to hunt the girl, perhaps develop some sort of relationship with her. So again, this is where it also goes to interpretation of how much was he like literally hunting and how much of it was more quote unquote hunting through maybe like emotional manipulation or abuse or something like that. But it seems like potentially they might have formed a sort of relationship, and maybe the girl for a time thought that this was a real relationship and indulged in it. But then he tried to strike, but failed. She flips the tables, and then, the light leaves his eyes. But now that she's left, she still maybe has some sort of emotional baggage here, because the memory of him keeps her warm and safe in her bed. But what's interesting is then we get, there lies a pile of bones and echoes of a love that's dead and gone. So this is why I mentioned in our, sort of opening introduction to this episode, to check out John Keats's Isabella or the Pot of Basil. Because basically in that one, you have Isabella and I think his name's Lorenzo, but I may be mixing that up with the Eve of St. Agnes. But basically she's in love with this guy. He ends up getting killed by her brothers. It's like a medieval epic. And so she keeps his head in a pot of basil to sort of comfort her. And I'm sort of getting almost similar vibe, although in this scenario it seems like the Isabella, if you will, was a bit more active in the demise of her lover. But so there lies a pile of bones and echoes of a love that's dead and gone. Now again, this is sort of where it gets a bit difficult with some of the language, where I'm not sure if there's a pile of bones, comma, and echoes of a love that's dead and gone. So you have your pile of bones, and then separately from that, you have the echoes of this, love that's dead and gone. Or if they're connected, and therefore it's, there's this pile of bones, and the bones are the bones of the love that's dead and gone, and therefore the bones are symbolic. It'd be like the bones of their relationship. Or is it literal bones of the he from this opening part of the verse? So we have the pile of bones and echoes of love that's dead and gone, seen it all, been done before, cliche, but it's real history. So what's interesting with sort of this dead and gone is we have to ask ourselves, does this mean that the she in this scenario somewhat misses the he and feels conflicted about how things ended up? Does she, because she seems to be mourning the love that's dead and gone. It's not, that she's thrilled that it's over, because the memory of him keeps her warm. Although I also kind of wonder if the memory that's keeping her warm is the memory of his demise, or if it's the memory of him when things were good before, he was crying out, "God spare me, oh please." And then at the end, we get another passage from this other voice that's in parentheses that seems to be maybe a bit more knowing than the rest of them. And this sort of aside, if you will, says, "Seen it all, been done before, cliche, but it's real history." So this reveals that, the rest of this piece may be episodic in nature, in that, this he and she, this is all we're going to see of the two of them, potentially. And it's more, this is an opening example, if you will. Or if they're going to then continue to describe, and they're like, hey, so you may be thinking this story's cliche, but, I'm going to continue telling it because it's real history. Or if it's saying like, yeah, this is just another case example of this sort of dynamic. And though you may think it's cliche, it's real history, which is sort of goes along with the expression that fiction or reality is often stranger than fiction, which basically states that, like things may sound really absurd in history. And if it was fiction, you would say, that's absurd. That would never happen. This author is, being way too unrealistic. But the truth is that in reality, strange things often occur. So yeah, as I said, it's a bit of a tough one to sort of dive into and immediately get a sense of what's going on. Normally with these, when we jump into this, we look at that opening passage to try to figure out sort of the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why, because that'll usually inform the rest of it. But right now, what I would say we have is a narrator who has so far told the story of, a evil man and a woman who is able to sort of triumph over that, but may have mixed feelings about it. So let's jump into the next part, though, and see if we can get, a bit more clarity. So now we have our pre-chorus, chorus, and post-chorus. So the pre-chorus goes, repeating over again, you are all the same in the end. Then the chorus, which goes, oh, you're restricted in the bitter end. You've no conviction. Tell me your story now. And then the post-chorus, which goes, set it in stone, let it be known by those who pay attention, restricted by your own hand, the end. So as for rhyme scheme within this, we have again and end, which kind of have a similar sound with the again and end part, but they're not like perfect rhymes. Then we have restricted and conviction, and that T or that CT sound is repeated in both of them, but since one ends in a D and one with an N, it's not perfect. Then we get end and now, which don't rhyme, and then attention and end, and the end here rhymes with the ends that go on here, so we get a different color. So we have end, attention, conviction. Those are sort of similar. So we have attention and conviction. And then now we have that being used sort of like, it's the same word, but we have that repeating sound. And then again, like I said, again and end have a similar like N sound. I feel like those words are starting to sound funny after saying them so many times. But anyway, so, as we're trying to parse together again to remind us of that opening, we have a narrator who's telling a story about this evil guy who likes to hunt people. He chooses the wrong victim. The tables are turned on him. And then we get, though, that the woman may sort of hold on to the man, onto the man in a sort of like, I don't know, not like a nostalgic way, but sort of sentimental in a way. And we're not totally sure, again, the full lengths of that. So which makes me kind of think of the title, which is Monsters and Men. So even in the beginning, it seemed like the man was the monster, but if it's monsters and men, it almost makes you think that this is perhaps men who are disappointing and evil, cruel, etc. And they're basically accidentally falling for or into the traps of monsters. But monster here, where we normally have a negative connotation with monster, perhaps this is more of a sort of flipping it on its head, where the monsters are sort of the heroes. And the men would tell you that they're monsters, but in reality, they're sort of the champions, while the men are the real quote-unquote monsters, if that makes sense. That fits with the opening verse in that the man is actually pretty monstrous in that he's, walking around without a soul, and he has this anger that's gnawing away at him, and he hunts people. And, we normally think of monsters as hunting, down prey and having that sort of like anger / like kind of primal rage, if you will. So we have all of that. And then something happens where she is able to overcome this guy who's able to hunt all these other people. So maybe she's sort of a quote-unquote monster in disguise, where he didn't realize that she actually was quite powerful. But again, it almost flips the sort of like the morality of it, the sort of scales of morality, where we would normally think of the monster as the villain and the man as the good guy. It's flipped. So anyway, to the chorus, we have repeating over and over again, you're all the same in the end. So I think this part is referring back to that last part of the first verse where they say, hey, you've probably heard this story before, you've seen it over and over again, but it's, it's history, it's real. Even if you think it's cliche, it's like, it's undeniable that this goes on and on and on and on. So again, repeating over and over again, you are all the same in the end. I would say that the you there is referring to the men. Oh, you're restricted in the bitter end. You've got no conviction. Tell me your story now. Now, this is difficult because I feel like this doesn't tell us too much about that sort of like meaning. Again, because we don't know who this speaker is yet. I don't know. Like, I know that Shiori is an archivist, so I don't know if this song is in a way Shiori going through volumes of stories of different sagas of, this battle between monsters and men, if you will, and she's archiving it, and as she archives it, she's sort of, revealing a bit of her own biases, and she's thinking like, these men have no conviction, they're all the same in the end, and it's a bitter end, which is, I guess, again, kind of an interesting twist, is that if the man is the one who loses in the end, then it's a bitter end to his perspective, but it's actually sort of a triumph of the monster, but perhaps history has written it as the man is falling prey to the monster. And that goes back to the whole, is this cliche, but it's real history. History is written by the victors and, the loudest voice. And so, they may be writing it that the men are, victims to monsters in this. Set it in stone, let it be known by those who pay attention, restricted by your own hand, the end. So here it feels like this kind of goes into the whole concept, potentially, of Shiori being an archivist, and she's sort of setting these stories in stone, which, means to record it, so that it can't be misremembered or, changed later. If it's in stone, it's been carved into a stone, you can't erase it, like if it was with pencil. Let it be known by those who pay attention. So only those who pay attention are going to really be the ones looking at these stories set in stone. But restricted by your own hand, the end. The restricted part is interesting to me. I don't fully know what we're supposed to basically take from the use of saying restricted. Are they saying that they're restricted by their own nature? So they can't, not that they can't help themselves, but they act this way because in the end they are monsters. Monsters being the men in this scenario. And I don't know, the O is interesting because I feel like that can sometimes come off as sort of condescending or belittling, or I guess a better word would be sarcastic, where if someone was saying, well, I can't help it, my hands are tied here, hands being tied being a similar image to being restricted. If you're saying, oh, well, my hands are tied, and then they proceed to give a really, flimsy excuse, you might respond with, oh, so you're restricted. That's, what really is going on is you have no conviction. I kind of think that's what's going on here, but we'll have to look at the rest of the piece to, really be able to decide that. So now we get the second verse, which goes, smell of iron blood fills her lungs, stepping on them as they lay. On a field of pain she stays, guiding them all to their final grave. A soldier boy hears her voice, leading him far from the fray. As she cries one single tear, he'll fall on a sword, then they disappear. Do you fear your humanity? Oh, it's beautiful, dear. And oh, can't you hear all the stories untold? I'll make them clear. Are you the next new chapter for me? Written in ink, all that you think is a piece of history. So right from the get-go, I can see that there's quite a lot of musicality to this one. So we get smell of iron blood fills her lungs, stepping on them as they lay. That already has like a very musicality where it's like smell of iron blood fills her lungs, stepping on them as they lay. We also get on a field of pain she stays, guiding them all to their final grave. And then we get far from the fray. She cries a single tear. He'll fall on a sword, then they disappear. The disappear rhyming with tear. We get fray and lay, grave. Does grave rhyme with anything? I don't think so. Then we get dear and clear. Then we get me and history. So we get a rhyme there. There's like a lot of, next new chapter. We get, oh, can't you hear? There's this like H sound going on there. Field of pain she stays, guiding them all to their final grave. Guiding them all to their final grave. This one just has like a lot of musicality and a lot of the type of rhythm that we would see in poetry. There's not like a clear rhyme scheme in terms of like, oh, that means this is a sonnet or something like that. But it's just like a very well-written verse in terms of that sort of rhythm. I'm hoping as you heard me read it and kind of reread over it just then, you could kind of hear that sort of like rat-a-tat-tat rhythm that goes along with it. It's very satisfying to say out loud, and that's why they always say when you read poetry, you should read it out loud. As for the meaning and sort of deciphering this, there's a lot to cover. So we get a smell of iron blood fills her lungs. So it's not that blood is filling her lungs, but it's the smell of it, and specifically the iron smell that's filling it. So, some people describe, fresh blood as smelling like iron. And so it's filling her lungs because she's breathing in the smell of the blood. And she's stepping on them as they lay. What's interesting here is, as we see in the whole passage, it sounds like this she figure is walking through a battlefield and kind of walking over the fallen. However, it's interesting that she steps on them as they lay, not where they lay, but it almost sounds like as they fall and lay on the ground, that's like almost right afterwards she steps over them and on them. And so, in my opinion, it's clear that we're getting sort of some imagery of like a Lady Grim Reaper here, sort of a Moray Calliope, if you will, because it says, on a field of pain she stays, guiding them all to their final grave. A soldier boy hears her voice, leading him far from the fray. Could also maybe be a Valkyrie. I realize as I'm saying this, like if Shiori was going for more of a like Nordic sort of monster vibe in that sense. Although I feel like we classify the Grim Reaper as a monster? Because I feel like we also don't fully. I feel like Valkyries are closer to like angels, but do we classify those in like a bestiary as being monsters? I'm not really sure. Tangent aside, a soldier boy hears her voice, and the voice leads him from the fray being the battle. But as she cries for him, he falls on a sword. And that sort of like, basically means like leaving the Minecraft server or whatever it is we have to say on the internet. But then as they expire, they disappear, which is sort of interesting. So you can almost imagine all these bodies. They fall, she steps on them, and then they disappear into dust. Also, it's a field of pain. So this isn't the site of a glorious battle where there was, a clear winning team that were the good guys and the bad guys lost. But instead, it's sort of a monstrous battle of two, just human factions that have caused just pain for each other and a lot of bloodshed. And she's not happy at this, and so she cries a single tear. Then do you fear your humanity? Oh, it's beautiful, dear. Well, what is our humanity? Well, part of our humanity is the fact that we live and we die. I think that's a big, part of being human, is sort of our consciousness about the fact that we will die one day. And so I think that might be sort of what's being discussed here, but that it can be beautiful. And oh, can you hear all the stories untold? I'll make them clear. Are you the next new chapter for me, written in ink? All you think is a piece of history. So I would argue that here we actually have a shift. We're going to have one part which describes this sort of mythic Lady of the Dead / Grim Reaper / Valkyrie / maybe like an embodiment of war itself, potentially. And then we get, which feels like this is more of a part that Shiori would be speaking, where she's trying to once again archive the stories which are untold, make them clear. And then Shiori's almost wondering in an aside, like, oh, are you going to be the next new chapter for me? It's going to be written in ink. All that you think is a piece of history. Written in ink is interesting because it also has to do with carved in stone, where when we say something is written in ink, it's more permanent. It's sort of like once it's written in ink, you can't change it, which sort of goes back to, older days where ink was rare and wasn't as erasable and all that stuff. And also like documentation was much more permanent, if you will. But what's interesting is one has to ask, is this she potentially the same she as before? I don't think so. I think I was correct in my guess that this is sort of a episodic type of song, where the first one describes the woman who vanquishes the monster / the hunter guy, and then here we're getting a different she, because that's the shift reveals this, because she's saying, are you going to be the next chapter? As in, she already wrote her chapter on the previous she, and now she's come across another interesting, quote unquote, monster. And I think it's interesting is there once again is this she and he dynamic, even though it's a different she and he. And once again, that reminds me of the title, which is Monsters and Men, which makes me think that again the she's are actually the monsters, monster here being this sort of Lady Death figure, and the men are more like classic mortal men as we would think of them. But just as the first man was, clearly a bad person, here we sort of see that, the actions of men have created war, and war is a horrible thing, and therefore, in that way, the real monsters may be the men who are waging war on one another, while here the monster being this Lady Death, Mori Calliope figure, she's actually very sympathetic. She cries a tear, she guides a soldier boy out of the fray. I also think it's important to acknowledge that the use of boy here seems to be telling us a lot. As I say with all these episodes, when you're writing poetry, songs, things like that, you have way less words than you have in like a novel. So you have to be very, careful about your word choice and very specific with it. So what's interesting here is instead of just saying a soldier hears her voice leading him far from the fray, it's a soldier boy, which I think the use of boy there is just to emphasize that this is a young boy who is at war, which is all the more horrific to imagine, being a young, basically potential child soldier being forced to fight in this battle. Although, again, it's a little ominous that after hearing her voice and being led away from the fray, he still has to fall on a sword. And again, falling on a sword is a sort of self-inflicted act, if you get what I'm saying. And But one has to wonder, is it self-inflicted in this context, or is he sort of hypnotized in a way, if you will? I almost feel like I should have mentioned, as I did in The Poetic Genius of Nerissa Ravencroft, make sure you check that one out. We talk about La Belle Dame sans Merci by John Keats, and I feel like a lot of that is relevant here as well. But yeah, I think this second portion is a bit more clear. It's just about doing this sort of archiving, but let's get into the next portion and see where this piece goes. So here we get our next pre-chorus and chorus. The pre-chorus going, repeating over again, you are all the same in the end. And the chorus going, oh so persistent in the bitter end, no more resistance, tell me your story now. So kind of a lot of interesting stuff going on here. To quickly discuss the rhyme, again, we have sort of the again and end sort of have a similar N sound. Persistent and resistant, both of the SIST sound, but end differently. And then end and now don't have any sort of rhyme there. You could argue that the end here rhymes with the end here. But more so, I think what's interesting is what's being said here is I'm sort of under the impression with this piece that Shiori, as the archiver, is talking to the she's, if you will. Again, none of them are named. We don't get their actual, if they are monsters, if they're not, if I'm just putting too much from the title into the song. But I was under the impression that a lot of it was pretty sympathetic towards the she, in that they deal with a man who has no soul and who is, angry, or a bunch of men who are, doing man-made war and all the horrors of that, etc. But then in the last verse, Shiori, or this main speaker, basically says, well, I want to speak to you. Are you going to be the next verse in my story? And it seems like she wants to be, as an archivist, archive the story of this she figure. But here, she seems much more sort of aggressive and sort of exasperated, saying, oh, repeating over and over again, you are all just the same in the end. You're so persistent in the bitter end, no more resistance. Tell me your story now. Now, it's hard because I don't know if we're supposed to read that as being like totally aggressive and totally, I don't know, almost antagonistic in a way where it's like, oh, you're all just the same. Or if it's more like, yeah, you're always trying to, resist telling me your story, but I'm the archivist, so just stop trying to resist and just tell me your story, which could be in a context of, almost like if a detective has a very important witness, they're trying to get the witness to tell them what they saw, but the witness is afraid to. And so the detective has to be like, seriously, just tell me what you saw. I'll take care of it, kind of thing. It's hard to say, but I feel like the use of bitter end and repeating over and over again, and the expression, you are all the same in the end, these feel very aggressive and not very kind detective, if you will. What does that mean in a larger sense? I'm not really sure. It's sort of difficult to say because, like I said, I thought that she was pretty sympathetic to these quote-unquote she figures with this sort of she and he dynamic. So I think the only thing we can really do at this point is jump into the next passage and see if it sort of informs us more one way or the other. So now we get our bridge, which goes, they rise and fall and crawl to the top again, and raise their swords but never will defend. Walking on the path of the condemned, the peasant king and queen lose heads in the end. Now, this one is very interesting considering that we've been talking about this she and he dynamic in this every other one has started with a she or a he, and there's a clear division between them. But here we get they, which is a combination of she and he. It's a group word. So they rise and fall and crawl to the top again and raise their swords but never will defend. Walking on the path of the condemned, the peasant king and queen lose heads in the end. Now, there's a lot of sort of like interesting, surprising language here. So they rise and fall and crawl to the top again. This makes me think, of politics, of people in power, of politicians, of kings, of rulers, of oppressors. This isn't usually something you think of commoners, the rising, the falling, and then if they fall, they crawl to the top again. Crawling almost as being seen as undignified. So if you crawl to the top and it's sort of undignified, I don't know why I added a Y there. You get the undignified, then you have to say, well, if that's undignified to crawl to the top, why are they so desperate to get to the top, and is getting to the top sort of a bad thing? They raise their swords, but they never will defend, meaning that they only attack, and they don't defend anything. And defend things, not meaning defending their own power, but more like fighting in the name of something else is usually that sort of defense. So we have that, and then we have walking on the path of the condemned. So, that's almost reminds me of like in Game of Thrones, of the sort of walk of shame. You walk on the path of the condemned, but the peasant king and queen lose heads in the end. So the hard part is, I don't know if this is saying literally like, if two peasants were able to rise and fall and crawl to the top and become king and queen, normally in fiction, usually that's seen as a good thing, because in classic fantasy, if someone starts as a peasant and then works their way up to becoming a king, it's usually a good thing, because it sort of implies that they actually will know what it's like to be a peasant, and therefore will be more like representative of the commoners, who usually make up the larger body of the society, rather than the elites just protecting and representing the elites. But I don't know if it's saying that, or if it's sort of a mocking of like, even kings and queens are peasants in the eyes of God, or something like that. I don't know if it's saying it in that sense. Or, what's funny about language, to sort of just be playful for a bit, is that, we also don't know if it's a peasant king and then a queen, or if it's a king who is a peasant and a queen who is a peasant, or if it's like a weird where you have your queen and then you have a peasant who marries her and becomes a peasant king. But they lose their heads in the end. What's interesting about that is, this makes me think, in a way, the Shiori character, whether it's actually Shiori or just a different archivist, and Shiori's presenting a fictional story. It doesn't, basically poems don't have to be autobiographical. I don't know if what they're trying to really say here is that they're almost exhausted by how stories are always the same. Whenever I've read 1,000 stories, and in it they always just rise and fall and crawl to the top again. The peasant queen and the queen, they always lose their heads in the end. I don't know if that's what she means in that it's like the ending is always predictable. But if they're walking about the condemned, they're rising and falling, they're not defending things, it almost seems like, like the not defending things makes it seem like this peasant king and queen are bad people because they only ever attack, and then later they walk on the path of the condemned. Well, if you're walking the path of the condemned, that means you've been condemned, which means you're bad, or at least have been judged to be bad. So that makes me think that this is about like, two ambitious people who kept, doing bad things effectively to try to get to the top, but eventually they were caught, forced to walk the path of the condemned, and so in the end they lose their heads. Is this just its own separate episode in this sort of he-she saga? But in that case, why is it in the bridge? And I'm really not sure. I don't have a good answer for you. I have, you can have your own theories, but I don't have a confident answer of like, this is definitely what Shiori was trying to get at with this. So let's go to the next passage and see if maybe we can learn some more and then retroactively apply that to what we've read thus far. So here we get the final part of the song/poem. We get our pre-chorus, chorus, and post-chorus, and they go, reading tales of monsters and men. Oh, it's all the same, just nonsense, repeating over again. You're all the same in the end. Oh, you're restricted. Oh, I know every game, I've read every name. And I know you're all bound by your chains. You've no conviction. Oh, I know every game. I've read every name. And I know that you'll tell me your story now. Set it in stone. Let it be known by those who pay attention. Restricted by your own hand. The end. As for looking at things like the rhyme, we get men, nonsense, again, and end. Once again, these are similar sounding, but not quite. We get restricted, conviction. There's sort of the ict sound there. Tell me your story now, bound by chains, name and name. Bound by your chains, so not game and name. We get set it in stone, known. These two sort of rhyme. Attention doesn't rhyme with end. Restricted by your own hand. The end. So there's some rhymes, but nothing's, so much so that would help us learn more about the theme, let's say. I think it's more just about having a musicality to it. However, what I want to get into is I kind of feel like this is an extremely interesting ending because it takes phrases and passages from earlier in it, but now it gives us further context, and it sort of helps illuminate what the song might be about. And there's actually whole poetic forms that are like this. For example, do not go gentle into that good night. I'm just going to write as Do Not Go Gentle by Dylan Thomas. I think they're called like villanelles. Don't quote me on that since I'm doing this on the spot. But check out that poem and you'll see that the way that the lines sort of repeat each other, and like the last line of a stanza might be the first line of the next stanza, or the last stanza sort of has different, or the last stanza has different lines from across the poem, things like that. It's a very difficult way to write. It's one of the like hardest poetic forms because you have to make sure that you have it all connected in a way that all of your lines will make sense as the last paragraph, or if you write the last paragraph first, you have to then figure out like organic, authentic ways of incorporating those lines into earlier passages of the poem. Basically, it just takes a lot of planning and it's pretty difficult. But so we get reading tales of monsters and men. So we get our title drop. We get the fact that Shiori is reading these tales. So it's not that she's like witnessing them out in the wild. It's more that she's in a giant library reading through all these books. There's this sense of exhaustion of, oh, it's just the same. It's just nonsense. The same story repeats over and over again. You are all the same in the end. And that's sort of funny because that is sort of how real storytelling goes. We've talked about it here before, but you got the hero's journey, where you have your hero. He starts at home. He gets a refusal of the call. He starts to get immersed in the other world. He goes through his trials. He then has like a duel with, the evil person. He loses something. Then he finally has like the big fight, and then he goes back home, but he's changed. We see that in like every story ever. Star Wars is like a perfect one-to-one of this structure. We also have Freytag's Pyramid, which is, you get your introduction to the story, the inciting incident, the rising action, the climax, and then the resolution and the falling action. You get all of that, where we're able to sort of like chart out stories with these patterns, since they all sort of follow the same pattern. So Shiori, as the archiver, seems to be reading all these tales of monsters and men and desperately wants something original and unique. And that's why I think she keeps on reading them. It's not, I've read tales of monsters and men, but she's intentionally using the tense of reading to make it still present tense. So it's something she's actively doing. She's searching for something that isn't the same in the end. And then, oh, you're restricted. Oh, I know every game. I've read every name. So she's, basically flexing that she's read it all. She knows it all. Nothing is surprising her. She picks up a new book. It's not going to surprise her. And the thing is I don't think she's really just talking about books in that sense. I think that's sort of a metaphor for more like scenarios in the real world. If you were to replace these books with, newspapers or like true crime or, just the news, you start to get a sense of like this exhaustion with like the state of the world always sort of being disappointing. You've got no conviction. Oh, I know every game. I've read every name. And I know that you will tell me your story now. So there's sort of a shift here in that perhaps since she's read or is reading stories of monsters and men, and she's come across those stories and they always feel the same to her, she may be searching for a story that is unique. So she may be looking for something that she can read and then, or, come across and basically interview someone, have them tell them her story that will finally be new and unique. She wants to set it in stone, to let it be known by those who pay attention. Restricted by your own hand, the end. Now, the restricted part, I still feel like I don't fully know what that means. I have like theories about, you could say that your hands are tied, so you are making a bad excuse or a flimsy excuse for bad behavior, let's say. That could be it. But by your own hand, normally means you're doing it to yourself. So I guess it could still be that, like, if you're saying, oh, my hands are tied, I can't help you, and then Shiori's almost pointing it out as saying, like, well, who tied your hands, quote unquote. It's it's by your own hand, by your own doing, you've become restricted. So is that a valid excuse? However, I have to wonder, like, what is this an excuse for? I began this thinking that this was very much pro the she and anti the he, and to kind of be talking about how, there's all these stories of men being bad and having, quote unquote, bad behavior. And then the she's having to deal with it and, triumphing. But then we got that bridge where it was saying that both the peasant king and the queen will lose their head, and they both have to walk down the path of the condemned. And here we get that she's reading stories of monsters and men, and it's all the same. She's not sparing the quote-unquote monster, so she's not sparing the she. She seems to be sort of exasperated and exhausted by both parties. So maybe it's kind of a larger scope thing where she's sort of separating herself from humanity / society as a whole, and she's sort of sick of all of it. She's sick of war. She's sick of, maybe abusive relationships with that first verse, unless I'm totally reading that wrong. But maybe it's that. So now she's searching for a new story, which is basically a different way of saying she's searching for people who won't disappoint her by just being the same, repeating the same excuses, and doing the same bad things. So it's not just the he, it's also the she. She's sort of separating herself from both parties. But it's hard to say. And so this is sort of where I turn it to you guys and I say, well, what do you think? What are sort of your interpretations of this? Because with these close reading exercises, you do it usually on a first read. The whole thing is you get your book, you get your highlighter, you get your red pen, and you go through and you annotate it to try to get a better understanding. And I feel like I've picked up on some of the themes. There's themes of this sort of exhaustion with people always ending up being the same and being disappointing. It's always the same thing over and over again. People always disappoint you. they always do bad things, and also sort of being disappointed with humanity as a whole. Like, we are all technically responsible for things like war and things like that. And we need to do change, but maybe we're not doing the change. And so there's sort of that, these are all the tales of monsters and men. However, I do feel like I'm still a bit confused by some of the apparent differences in the gender stuff, in that the bridge confused me because, again, it sort of incorporated the she as being also to blame, while the first two verses made it seem like this was more about the she's having to deal with the he's. So what are your thoughts, and how do you interpret the whole restricted part? Again, I'm kind of thinking of it as like, if you're saying you're restricted by your own hand, you're claiming that it's just your nature, and that, it's like, well, I can't change things. I can't do anything different. I'm restricted. My hands are tied. But she's pointing out that those restrictions are by your own hand, and if they're by your own hand, you should be able to undo those restrictions yourself. They're basically false bounds, if that makes sense. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up. So I wanted to thank you all for checking this out and giving it, a watch/listen, if you kind of treat these like podcasts. So if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. It really helps grow the channel and sort of gets it out there so more people can see it. So hopefully we can get more discourse in the comments, because especially with tough ones like this, I really want to hear what your thoughts are and how you're interpreting it, because I don't feel like I got a fully clear understanding of it by the end of it. But you don't always have to. That's sort of the charm with poetry, is that you can return to it time and time again and always get something new out of it. The ambiguous parts sometimes are the most intriguing, because you sort of mull over it over and over and over and over again, and you'll come to new interpretations each time. Which then leads me to ask, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you agree with my interpretation? Do you disagree? And if so, why? And in general, what were your thoughts on this song, this project, etc.? Please let me know in the comments. But with that being said, I think I'm going to wrap this one up. If you have any suggestions for any other songs you'd like me to check out, please let me know. But until that next episode, take care.